Imagine you're driving by a place of worship that you've never been to before. Maybe it's a mosque or a synagogue, or a temple for a religion that you're unfamiliar with. How do you feel about that place? And what do you think about the people that worship there? What are the questions that come to mind first? Does it feel mysterious to you? And is it a place that you could see yourself visiting? If it's not a place you would see yourself visiting, ask yourself why not. And then imagine that that's how someone else feels about your church. If you're part of an active church family, it's easy to miss the fact that for the rest of the neighborhood, your church may be that mysterious place. Every story, every baby dedication, every marriage and funeral and testimony that you see happening there may be completely missed by the people living right next to that church building. How well do we really know the neighborhoods and cities that our churches are in? How well do we really understand our own presence there? Building bridges between our churches and their surrounding communities takes a whole lot of intentional effort. It means we have to take the time to get to know our neighbors. It means we have to ask about the ways we've affected them and be ready to repair the relational damage that we may have caused even if we didn't know. That's what this episode is all about. Earlier this year, I had the chance to sit down with my own mayor. I wanted to ask him how people in my faith tradition could do a better job of serving my town and what kinds of things create a healthy environment where great relationships can thrive. We don't always have an accurate picture of how our service projects and evangelistic efforts and programs really affect our neighbors. I wanted to ask him about that. In this episode, we'll explore all that and more. Welcome back to Bridges Over Walls.
So, Caleb, thanks for inviting me. I'm Michael Milch. I'm the mayor of Gladstone, Oregon. We're a small city of about 12,000, a little bit outside of Portland. Thank you for inviting me.
Yeah, I'm really glad to have you. The first time that I saw you in person was actually at this community event. We had my favorite smoothie shop in town closing. I was close friends with the owners and all of the employees and everything, and there's only two. But I remember you showing up to that. And one thing that I so greatly admired was you didn't take any opportunity to make it about you. You showed up as a person, as a member of the community. And I think that that captured something that I would love to see in people of faith, is that you weren't there to get, voters. You weren't there to build allies for your political thing. You weren't there. All those things could happen and it would be beneficial. But the reason that you're there is because you care about the people around you. Looking forward in my life when I'm 60, 70 years old, that's who I hope we are as the norm. That we're just there to support our community, to love them, and to really, no strings attached, be people who are welcome and people feel safe and want to be around. So
I think that's a good aspiration for any church, any faith community. To have those qualities. I had periodontal surgery that week. I could barely talk, and I was there to support Olive, of course.
Yeah.
But also to get a nice cold smoothie that would make my mouth and gums feel better. But if you saw it as something deeper than that, a quality of my character, I'm glad to accept that.
Yeah. I think as I age, that's the goal that I have for myself is, if my faith speaks, I don't want it to be because I said and laid out explicitly everything, but that the message was given not just through what I said, but how I lived, that I was living in a way that people were drawn to and welcomed into and safe around. As somebody who, faith has played an important role in your life for a long, long time, how do you manage your own personal convictions and the tension between that and making decisions for a wider range of people who don't share those beliefs? I think when you think about a Christian in government, a lot of times you think of somebody who's trying to impose, Christian prayer in schools, for example, or Christian culture and just protect their own religion at the cost of everyone else. That's not what I see in you. How have you gone about those two things, your personal faith, but also your responsibility to the people that you're leading?
Well, as an elected official, I could try to do everything that just works best for me personally. And there may be some elected officials who only identify with a narrow spectrum of people and act on their behalf. But one of the things that, one of the responsibilities is we have is to serve the community as a whole. And so I think you develop a strength as a leader if you are able to set aside your personal views and to look to the broader community and what's best for everyone. A lot of the decisions that I have to make as a leader have to do with issuing contracts to do jobs that will improve the quality of our water system or our sewer system. They're not glamorous, personal-oriented issues.
Sure.
They have to do with police and traffic and fire and protection and those kinds of things that wouldn't necessarily have a very direct faith component to them. But at the personal level, in reaching those decisions, it does involve listening to people, to respecting other views, to being able to, as you put it, see through the lens of someone else. And so I think that's the skill maybe that I bring from my faith tradition. I've been in churches that have struggled with political issues or social issues that were very divisive at a church level. So I'm not saying that the church or religious communities are immune from those kinds of conflicts. They happen there too. But that's the setting in which sometimes you learn to deal with those conflicts in a way that is respectful of people and involves more listening than judging.
But you've been able to see kind of not only the values and culture of Christianity change, but just kind of our role in our community and our thoughts on ourselves maybe change. What would be some of your advice for us, how to make positive change and how to work with the frustrations that you encounter and the obstacles that you encounter as you try to make those changes?
Well, part of what's changed is that there are other religious traditions more prominent in our country now. I don't think I ever knew anyone who identified, for example, as being Muslim when I was growing up. So there's a greater diversity of religious traditions present in our community. I graduated from high school. There were 850 in my class, and there was one African-American Black student in the whole graduating class. Where students now grow up with a much more ethnically and racially diverse community, and also a greater awareness that that even along gender lines and lines of sexual orientation, there's a broader community than I think I was ever aware of growing up, and an acceptance of that, and an awareness that how we refer to people and how we treat people makes a big difference. I can think back, with a little bit of shame about the kinds of jokes we told and the words we used to describe people when I was growing up. And I'm glad that there's a generation now that is aware that we need to be more sensitive to those issues. And one day I was sitting at lunch with my grandson around the table. This is a group of first graders. And one of the little boys sitting across from me said, "How come they want us to pay to drive on the freeway?" We have a discussion going on in Oregon right now about beginning a tolling system on some of our roads, some of our freeways, and it's been a controversial issue. But I thought, here's a 6-year-old, 7-year-old who has been paying attention to the conversation in his family. So I'm very hopeful about our younger generation, about their willingness to see the urgency of some issues that affect them directly, like guns, like the environment, the climate change, and frankly, what is, I think, put this in the most positive way, an impatience with the rest of us to act appropriately on these issues. They see them far more urgent. They see that these long-term issues affecting their generation far more than ours. My wife and I turned 70 this week, and my wife is approaching there. We may not feel as concerned about climate change as the people who know that the cities that they used to visit are going to be underwater, or that the trees that shelter them may not survive because of the change in the patterns of the weather. And so it's exciting to me to see that urgency translated into action at a local level. We can't just assume as a religious community that everyone out there is going to be seeking us, our presence, our action, the materials, the tracts or scriptures or whatever we might want to share. Many more people who now, if you ask them for religious preference, their answer is none.
Right.
And the Pacific Northwest, where we are right now, has been traditionally the headquarters of the none faith community or non-faith community, because there were more people here who, for whatever reason, had been turned off to the church or never grown up in it or just didn't have that as a part of their life. So the old door-to-door ministry may not be as well received as it was at one time. And that's one change. Just a change in facilities for churches, I've noticed. Land is more expensive. Construction is more expensive. Putting up large churches with stained glass windows and traditional wooden pews and pipe organs, we don't see that as much now. A lot of congregations that were active and growing and just, bulging at the seams with families and children, as you've alluded already, they're at the place now where that's not the case anymore. And all of these classrooms and facilities that were there to meet the needs of families aren't being used in that same way. And churches are beginning to re-examine their own relationship with their land, with their facilities, and with the neighborhood around them. And what we're seeing many places now is churches recognizing that the need for housing, affordable housing, is very important in many communities. And that the facilities that they have could be used as housing or converted to housing, or a portion of them could become a project that would really, in essence, be a new way of being in mission to the community. A couple of years ago, when we had some wildfires in this area, your denomination has a large piece of land. You became a site where people could, if they were evacuated from the area where they were living because of an impending wildfire coming close to them, they could stay here. You didn't ask for any religious credentials or anything like that. With those kinds of events, we need to respond and help one another. That was a time when the weather was in the 90s or the hundreds that week. And then about 6 months later or less, we had ice storms that brought down tree limbs and power lines. And many people in this community were without electricity for 3, 4, sometimes up to 12 days during that February weekend. We were one of the ones that were out of power for 12 days, so I remember it well. And there was another time where the community stepped up and people said, we need to provide a way to get hot meals to families who can't cook on their electric stoves anymore, or put things in the oven or the microwave. And we need to find a place to help the people who don't have any heat in their home.
Yeah. I love that you brought up those examples, because to me, those were some of the clearest examples of progress for my denomination. When you have people running from disaster and you're able to open your arms and your facilities and say, hey, no strings attached. We're not going to evangelize to you. We're not going to push anything on you. You don't have to sign up for anything. Just come be safe. To me, that was one of the clearest signs of something that we're doing right, where somebody is unsafe and we're able to provide safety. Somebody needs somewhere to be and we can provide that. And we can just show up and be just an active, helpful, safe presence in their life. That's the ideal for the future of this church. And so, that's a pretty good segue into the premise of this show, is that when we interact with our communities, especially, there can be a real difference in what we think we're doing and what what people actually see us doing, like their understanding of it. I don't know if you follow the news outlet Willamette Week, but there was a recent article about something that happened where a Adventist nonprofit group from Michigan just chose 5 zip codes in Portland and decided to blanket them with religious literature. Oh. So without people asking permission, without people wanting it, religious material was just kind of pushed into their mailboxes. And so, of course, people don't like that. But what we've had is at our churches, people are kind of writing angry letters, putting them in the book, and then dropping them off at our churches. And so there's just this real like breakdown of frustrating, relational dynamics right now, where it's like something that we didn't even choose to do is now kind of reflecting really poorly for people that really don't want to do things that way.
So, as I understand it, then you didn't have any knowledge of this beforehand locally.
No, nobody reached out and asked us. Yes. It was kind of, a business model where you go in, or these people went in and told everybody, hey, this is ministry. This is how we're going to reach this godless place of Portland, Oregon. And we're just going to send them the word, we're going to send them the truth. And then, I think the fiction that gets invented is, this is going to be something, somebody's going to get it and say, oh, thank you, and read it and be like, oh, my life has changed. But instead, more often, we're finding that people, they really don't want to have that stuff pushed on them. They want to have choice. They want to have, especially relationships. The more people that I talk to, the more they want to actually know somebody. And if you know somebody and you have a good relationship, then you can talk about the differences or similarities of your worldview, but start by getting to know them.
Well, and I think also it helps to start where you are. Yeah. To go across the country to minister to people, or go across the world, which has been the pattern of churches for centuries. You still are imposing a view from the outside. You haven't had a chance to form that relationship yet. You could invest the time and do that. But I think it's important to minister where you are in your community to the degree that's possible. I reflect on the years that I grew up in a church that operated the way I understood churches operated at that time.
Yep.
And now things are different. Sometimes there's a building, a presence, a church site in a community, but the members are all people who live far away and commute to it. Yep. on for Sabbath worship or other events. And they have a less direct relationship with the community than a church that the members and the facilities are all in the same place. And then you can kind of get to know what's going on there, what the needs are, what the desires are for that community, what the strengths of that community are that you might be able to build upon. We come from a faith tradition. You go back to the Hebrew Scriptures, a book of Jeremiah, the time when people were exiled from Jerusalem to Babylon. And they lived in a place where they didn't really want to be, and they were no longer in the community where they really identified. And a lot of people find themselves in that. We're a country that people move around a lot, and sometimes you end up living somewhere where it may not have been your first choice, but for financial reasons or whatever else, your job, that's where you are. But God's message to those people was to embrace that, to form families there, to plant food and grow and make that the place and find peace and prosperity in that community. And I think that's our task as churches, and not be so tied to a tradition that becomes a barrier in itself.
Yeah. I love that you brought that up, because that was a question that I had early on in my struggle with organized religion. Was just, there was a lot of talk about like, oh, we can't do this kind of service, or we can't do this kind of ministry or whatever because we don't have enough people. It's like, well, there's lots of options that exist though, that we could just bring the people we have to go help, right? But you want to talk about, just about anything, there's usually something that exists that desperately needs volunteers, that desperately needs people who are willing to give their time and energy. And yet I think the temptation comes from, well, we want something that's just ours so that we can attract people into just our church. There's kind of like a competitive or like a self-interested approach to ministry. But what I would love to see is these are the needs, and these are the best ways that we can help meet those needs. No strings attached. When I first started kind of feeling like what we do at church is not really connecting with our neighbors, one of the habits that I started was, I thought, well, how do I live the thing that I want the church to live? How do I create habits that I want to see in other people and that I feel like is missing? And one of the things that I created was just budgeting a small amount of money and time, where the whole point of it was, I'm going to spend half an hour to an hour a week connecting with someone here that I don't know. Whether that means going to the coffee shop and sitting down when I would have just taken my drink to go and just talk to the person in there. Whether that means here going up to the pickleball court and there's a bench and there's an older person sitting there, sitting by them and just asking what's going on or if they'll teach me. For years of my life now, I've taken just a little bit of time to reach out and find somebody I don't know in person or online and find a meaningful way to connect with them. And I think that it's turned into these real deep relationships that I didn't expect, where now the breadth of my community, whether they share my faith tradition or not, is just a really powerful core piece of who I am now. And it just takes that intentionality of like, I just want to get to know people because I want to get to know them. No agenda, nothing. Just I want them in my life. And then money, I look for local businesses. I look for people who need a little help with their college tuition or have car troubles that I can help with. And I'm not talking about hundreds of dollars. I'm saying, 25 or $50 a month that I just have waiting to help somebody. Those two habits have completely changed my outlook on who I can be as a person of faith in my community. Because of the feedback that I've gotten through those relationships, because people feel, even if you just took half an hour to talk to them about their life, seen, heard, valued, and welcome.
When you begin to make those connections, sometimes one connection leads to another.
Yep.
If you hadn't gotten involved in that little place that made the smoothies, you might not have met me in person. Not that that was the best moment of your life, but it turned out to be providential for both of us to make this connection, to have this opportunity. And that's where that connection with each other and that presence really does have compounding influence.
Yes. When I get the chance to talk with college students that are trying to figure out where to go as far as their first jobs out of college and that kind of thing, one of the top pieces of advice is not how to make a great resume. It's make connections and relationships when you don't need them. It's the top piece of advice is when you don't need something, just get to know people, go out and experience things, pitch in sometime, take a weekend and go volunteer somewhere. Because through those connections, all kinds of unexpected things happen. One of the pieces of advice my dad told me early on is plant seeds as often as you can, and then pick from what grows. So it's just the idea of just do stuff, get involved, make relationships, get to know people, and whatever turns out. And don't worry if something doesn't turn into something that benefits you. Just do it, and then from what grows, you'll be surprised what happens.
Sometimes little incremental things that we do at the city level, I know this is the case. We sometimes people want some nice, big, huge project, thinking that if we do this really big thing, it's going to make a big difference for us. Yeah. But really, that's not the way it usually works. Yep. City government is notoriously very slow in the time it takes to accomplish things. And what we do is accomplished at the very incremental level. We can't just force that to happen.
Yeah.
Somebody will say, well, I've got a pretty good recipe for Hawaiian shave ice. Mm-hmm. I'd like to open a little shop and do that and sell that. Yep. And somebody else might say, well, I'm pretty good at roasting coffee. That's something I can do, and I'll open a place to do that. And pretty soon, you've got a lot of these kinds of businesses in proximity to one another that open up, and some succeed and some won't. But eventually, you develop sort of a critical mass of destinations for people that draw you to that city and that support your economy and to create jobs and to create connections, places where people like you can hang out, you can meet somebody and connect with somebody else. Yep. Doesn't happen all at once, doesn't usually happen with some real big project, but it mostly happens because a few individuals, entrepreneurs at the city level will take that risk and say, I want to invest in this community. I want to make a difference here. And sometimes it's through a business. Sometimes it's through a desire to do something in service to the community. But however it happens, it's real important to our prosperity and our collective well-being.
My faith tradition can be one where you can lose your you can work for the system. You can be in community with just people who think like you. There's social activities forever to take up your time. And I think that there's kind of this natural breakdown of relationship where we tend to hang out with people who think like us And then there's less and less communication with the people around us outside of that. And then we kind of look separate. We kind of look isolated and siloed.
Well, and it's been shown that it's more than just hanging out with people that are like us.
Yeah.
You know, the choices we have of where to live and where we're going to put down our roots tend to sort us into these little groups of people who are very much alike. It used to be the norm that people would go to the place where the jobs were. You know, if there were good, promising jobs there, then that's where they wanted to live. And the trend is changing. Now people go to where the quality of life is what they're looking for. The relationship possibilities with people match their needs.
Yeah.
There's a guy who wrote a book called The Big Sort. And he talks about this idea that if you look at maybe voting precincts where at one time the difference between the two political parties was pretty close, you know, maybe 52% of one and 48% of the other. So you were likely to have neighbors who belonged to a different political party than you did, and a lot of other qualities that made them different than you. But it was even enough and close enough that you learned to get along with each other and be a good, supportive community. Now there are many more districts where the political races turn out to be very lopsided. One candidate, one party wins by much more than the other because people who have embraced the views of that particular political party, for example, have chosen to live there. That's the neighborhood that they've settled in. And there are cities that sort of gain a reputation of being a place that is more opening and welcoming to progressives versus conservatives, if I can use those terms. Sometimes all those knowledge workers or people in search of a certain life end up all in the same place.
Yeah.
It could be a benefit to that community. It could be maybe not so beneficial for society as a whole because we're not quite as integrated and inclusive as we need to be more opening and welcoming to one another. But we have sort of separated ourselves and segregated ourselves along various lines that divide us from one another.
Yeah.
And as you say, the more we are in those little groups of just people like us, the harder it is to overcome some of those divisions.
Yeah. I had a similar experience. The place that I grew up was not diverse at all. And to find anyone who kind of fell outside of the main demographic there was like something that people pointed out, like they talked about, and I've had a real journey of, I think as much as you want to be a good person, you also need exposure to other people, like real time with them and real, just time processing other people's voices instead of just what people say about them,
Right.
What does that journey look like for you as far as being, growing in your understanding of humanity and diversity and just the desire to, be around different perspectives and to learn from other people?
One thing that helped me, and I, during the campaign when I was running for office, you always try to present yourself in a positive way on an issue like this. And, I didn't want to be judgmental against people who have a harder time sort of dealing with some of these differences because of maybe their life experience was like yours and mine, very limited. But I grew up in a time when life was more racially segregated and people were not as open about differences in sexuality or gender identity. Yet over the years, it was because of expansion of my family in different ways that I became more attuned to these issues. So I married a woman who had a daughter who was gay. And to be accepting of her meant learning a little more about that. And I had a niece who married a man who was Jewish. And then she converted to Judaism and their children are being raised as Jews. And so I understand what that means as well, a little bit more than I did before. Yeah. The comment I made when I was running for office was listen to your family as it grows, because that's how you begin to understand and relate to people who are different from a little small segment of a society that you start in. By having them become part of your family, as a family expands, that can have a big impact on how you look at things.
Yeah. For me, it was story. I remember when Humans of New York started, There's just this Facebook page, this blog of just this photographer that would go out into New York City, and he would take pictures with permission of people, and then he would just sit down and talk with them and share what they said. And for me, because I didn't grow up in a very diverse area, it was one of the very first times that I was getting to see through the lens of someone else's eyes, through their perspective, through how they thought about their life and how they saw the world. And because there were so many stories coming out through that page, I really feel like there was a transformation of my character and my views of other people over time, because I was so fascinated by this, where suddenly all these people that my community had talked about, had told me about, I wasn't getting that version anymore. I was getting just piece by piece people's own version of their own lives. And it was really powerful. And it caused me to question how much I knew about the world, and also made me more open to just wanting to hear people's own voice. How do you think about your own experience? How do you tell your own story? And so I think the role of stories, is such a transformational thing in my life. And I think that more and more, as kind of social media explodes onto the scene, as we have access to things through the internet, as we have ways to connect with people, I think that that's playing a part in kind of the evolution of culture too, is just that we're able to take in voices that we didn't have access to before.
The church has traditionally been the strongest advocate
Yeah.
of the downtrodden and the person in need.
Yep.
And so, whether you want to put that in a political context or a government context, you can still advocate on behalf of the person who is homeless without having to take a position on how the government is going to address that issue.
Yeah.
A religious scholar named Eugene Peterson has written a translation or paraphrase version of the Bible called The Message. Yeah. It's very popular because it takes a lot of words that we have come to know in other translations and put them into a little more modern idiom. One of my favorite verses of his is John, the Gospel of John, 1st chapter, verse 14. And the Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. People have used that term incarnational ministry as a term that describes the way churches get involved in the area in which they reside and serve. Being Christ's presence in a community means moving into the community. See what your neighbor's needs are. Discover that coffee shop or that business or that other need that exists there, and be aware of it enough that you're able to offer something and be involved.